Pour commencer, je suis désolé, mais je parle français un petit peu seulement et je ne veux pas blesser vos oreilles et je suis parfois difficile à comprendre même en anglais. So please apologize. I apologize. Please accept my my apologies for having to come here, but speak English. It is a legacy of me, nothing else. So thank you very much for having me. I'm really enjoying my time here. I hope as much as my colleagues are enjoying their time with me. And what I want to do today is talk about this project, Sustainable Archaeology, both as a focus of research and as a kind of way of changing the way we think about archaeological practice. I work in Ontario. I work, as you know, as you probably know more than you should, I work across the last 1,000 years or so of the archaeology. It's and the archaeological record in Ontario, as it is here, as it is in most places, is a very rich archaeological record, reflects a long-term history of the endless generations of people going back to the time immemorial who continuously adapted their way of life to changing environments and landscapes, developed and adopted new ways of living, community, ritual, mortuary practice, and engage with the immediate and long-term, long-distance materiality of their lives to shape and redefine who they were. Additionally, the archaeology also shows that while the impact of colonialism by Europeans over the last 5 centuries has been significant in Ontario, these changes were gradual rather than sharp, and occurred within an Indigenous-centric worldview and an agency that reflects continuity within change and really survivance over those centuries of both cultural tradition and innovation, along with the complex materiality that documents that survivance. This is a record more robust and compelling, and one that leaves previous conventional models of assimilation and cultural decline behind as relics of the past and relics of past scholarship rather than historical facts. Moreover, today, contemporary descendants of those ancestral peoples from this part of the world consistently articulate a strong interest, care for, and desire to have a say in the outcome of managing their archaeological heritage, and have been increasingly successful at inserting their voice, distinct from that of archaeologists and archaeology-driven agendas, into the decision-making of that record. And yet, nonetheless, the archaeological heritage that I am a part of, that we all are a part of, that heritage is more about the history of archaeologists and an archaeologist's sensibility that has shaped the history of archaeological management, certainly in Ontario. We can look back in Ontario at over 150 years of archaeological practice, exploring the antiquities and reconstructing the ancient past of many generations of people who are here by avocational and professional archaeologists. And over that century and a half, an overriding focus of this practice, if you will, a principle and abiding obsession, maybe, is the accumulation of stuff. Come on now, behave. The things of archaeology. We collect the things of archaeology. And this really has been a core philosophy to us. Now, the intensity of this drive to accumulate accelerated dramatically over the last half century with the rise of a commercial consultant archaeology practice, also known as CRM or ARM, Archaeological Resource Management. The development of this very distinct kind of archaeology and the impact it's had on practice and the role of archaeology really in society more broadly is a similar story wherever you happen to be in the globe. It's really is born of an urgency to document a record and recover or accumulate that part of the record threatened by destruction of one kind or another, usually looting or the unintentional impacts of land use development. Come on. So at this point in time in the 21st century, CRM so dominates the archaeological practice really in much of the world, certainly in the Western industrial world, that it is the face of archaeology, certainly that people in government, public, and descendant groups of whatever stripe end up interacting with on their day-to-day. It's not the academic world, so we've had a real flip in our shape of practice, our face of practice. In Ontario, this kind of impulse to protect began to emerge through the Ontario Heritage Act, which was adopted in 1975. And this piece of legislation, amongst other things, requires that all archaeological fieldwork must be done by someone holding a license issued by the province. And it obligates the licensees to report on their field activities, to care in perpetuity all collections and field records that they generate under those licenses. And more recently, it's spurred a raft of guidelines and standards of practice that licensees are required to adhere to in the fieldwork, processing, and reporting of that activity. Now, these kinds of pieces of legislation, which you can find in most places, of varying intensities or not, is a key first step for conservation to happen, because it is an articulation that the state is saying that, yeah, archaeology is important to our society, and there has to be a responsibility at some level to care for this fragile and important public heritage. Never actually says archaeology, it usually talks about archaeology as the heritage of all. And as a result, the permitting or licensing of archaeologists really sets archaeologists apart from other people in society, in that they are allowed privileged access to this record, to interpret this record, to be really a state-sanctioned voice over the archaeological record. And by extension, those people who aren't eligible to hold permits, they don't have the degrees or the experience, are considered not allowed to access that record, whether they're looters or developers, or they have other ways of understanding the past. Now, the Heritage Act in Ontario, anyways, did not in itself birth conservation, broadly speaking. Rather, what it did is it created the state concern, and it facilitated for archaeologists the ability to say, well, if this is important to you, it should be important that these things are being destroyed when you build a highway, or when you put in a pipeline, or even when you put in housing, or let private landowners put in housing. And around this act was also created an archaeological bureaucracy of people who regulated practice in archaeology, who address those concerns. And this kind of led over about a 15-20 year period, the emergence of various conservation statutes in every development piece of legislation in the province. So that at this point in time, pretty much all regulated land use development activity on Ontario requires archaeological consideration. It doesn't mean an archaeological study every time, but it does mean that you need to ensure there is no archaeological impacts going to occur as a result of your development. So why do we care about that? Well, in part, this has created a new form of archaeologist, the commercial archaeologist, the consultant archaeologist. Because a developer can't address those concerns, they need to hire someone who holds a license and is qualified to hold the license to do that field work. This private sector consultant archaeologist really is something new, something since new for me as someone who's lived through it, 1980s. I realize some of my students keep pointing out that that's centuries ago, but that's just me. But it's become a viable, a permanent livelihood for many in the archaeological community, it really sustains an archaeological community far beyond any academic dimension of archaeology. These days in Ontario, which has fairly robust conservation legislation, there's about 200 to 350 people, depending on how you count them, who are mostly living full-time, being paid as archaeologists in the private sector. There's another 35 to 40 bureaucrats in various government agencies. And the industry, the commercial industry itself, it generates about $35 to $45 million a year in gross revenues addressing, just addressing archaeological concerns. Certainly a figure that would be staggering from a research point of view on an annual basis. There's about 50 to 60 archaeological firms in Ontario right now, and these range from large companies that employ over 50 individuals, do 300 to 400 projects a year, to engineering firms that have archaeological divisions, to mom and pop operations that are, you know, the archaeologist who's got a spare bedroom and that's their office, and they bid on maybe a dozen or two projects a year. So for me, understanding the scale of what's happened in archaeology is really important, as I'll get to. And in Ontario, although CRM really started late 70s, early 80s, the period of the mid-1990s, getting out of the last economic depression, not the last, but the last before the last, there was a sustained explosion in CRM activity in the province, as you can see in this chart here. Over the last 30 years, the number of individual projects have increased every year. In the decade between 1996 and 2005, for example, that work quadrupled, and it has again in the last decade. In the last 30 years, there's been over 18,000 archaeological surveys done in CRM that have led to the discovery of over 16,000 archaeological sites, everything from isolated find spots to industrial complexes to large-scale indigenous villages. And over 5,000 of these were subjected to archaeological excavation, either full or partial. Moreover, the continual gross increase of this stuff, it tapered off a little bit this past year, largely because renewable energy projects declined because there was an election and a government that did not like renewable energy, had a chance of winning. But given that these processes are so deeply embedded in every rote development process in the province, at the municipal and provincial level, there's nothing to suggest that this trend will stop anytime soon. So that means we get lots of stuff. There's lots of sites documented, and this rise in CRM, which has been very, very successful at recovering this record that'd be otherwise lost, is really, it's a core aim, I think, of, it's really realized a core aim of cultural historical archaeology, the traditional way in which archaeology used to think of itself, which has been at play through much of the 19th and 20th centuries. In other words, the accumulation of things and sites of archaeology, the objects, fragments, bits, and remains that are classified, analyzed, and stored away to ensure continued archaeologists' access to the past. So, in fact, so normalized is this extractive, consumptive approach to the archaeological record in North America and in many industrial societies that we've done a very good job at convincing many people, including approval authorities and people in government, that this is the way archaeologists must access the past, and it's the way to counter impacts to the record. The trick, of course, is that we've been so busy making sure we get those sites and go out to the next project and review the next report that there has been little capacity to think about what we are in terms of a practice, in terms of a part of our societies we live in today. The orthodoxy of extraction consumption mean that CRM archaeologists are kind of a unique type of practitioner. They deal with issues that happily I don't have to in an academic setting at all. They have to mediate on a daily basis developers and approval authorities and dissenting groups of various kinds challenges to their rationale for why they do what they do and for what purpose and why is it this person's cost or that person's cost and how to do it. In other words, these guys have to answer questions, really big theoretical questions about what is archaeology and what's it all about and how is it really about people's heritage that needs to be conserved in a way that is both profound and incredibly menial too, because it's being grappled with in the context of, I gotta get this job done, and I gotta get it done because my client wants the job finished, and I gotta figure out how to get it done tomorrow. That's a context for thinking about archaeology that very few of us outside of that whole regulatory and commercial practice ever have to really engage with outside of fairly abstract conversations after several beers. And the rise of this extraction consumption paradigm is also, oh, that was good. Just didn't start my clock now, so I'm only now ready. Has really affected practice in two ways, in our sensibilities in two important ways. First, fear of losing the record really drives calls for site consumption, since site loss denies archaeologists access to our stuff, the raw resources we need to add to our interpretations of the past. So we don't want to lose that record, we want to make sure we get that record. The second implication is that loss is avoided, that horrible thing is avoided, if the research value of the site is extracted by digging up that site. So happily, that works really well with development processes and approval processes, because you get an archaeologist in there, you rip it out of the ground, and go ahead and build afterwards because the important stuff's gone. So we do a lot better in terms of heritage conservation in municipalities than, for example, architectural groups who the only option, unless you want to warehouse these things in some parking lot somewhere, the only option is preservation and reuse. And unless you're in a World Heritage Center like Quebec City, chances are your local municipality isn't that interested in investing money in preserving a built heritage resource, and it's so much easier to flatten it and build a cinder block structure instead. In fact, one of the directors of the Ontario Heritage Program said, you know, after 30 years, the Ontario Heritage Act has managed to preserve exactly 0 architectural buildings of importance, and the only buildings that are preserved arises out of the will of a community to do so, and there is no way to impose that kind of regulatory regime from a provincial level. So in other words, developers get us because they throw a bunch of money at us, we pull it out of the ground, they get to build, they're happy. So that's what we've been doing. But of course, the other shoe drops. 30 years in, it's starting to get scary to think about and look at the accumulated output of this hugely intensive activity. And we end up with this kind of overconsumption of the record, everything's being pulled out of the field, and the result is underdigestion, if you will, if I can work that metaphor past decency, in the sense that we don't do anything other than write reports. There's very few, collectively speaking, of those 5,000, 6,000 sites excavated or 16,000 sites documented that enter into an analysis and a research and advancing knowledge of the past kind of sensibility. And that's a problem because it tends to subvert our claims that the commercial archaeology is about anything other than harvesting and accumulation for the sake of rote compliance and livelihood and salaries. So we're harvesting this particular resource for our livelihood rather than for this greater good that we often tend to point to. At the scale at which collections are being consumed, or sites being consumed, Conceits such as, you know, we're digging it up now, future generations of archaeologists are going to come along and they'll analyze it all and advance our knowledge, and so that's why we're doing it. You know, I've been around long enough to know that that's not the case at all, and we keep making more of these collections. There's not really consistent standards of care and long-term management of these collections. Collections in commercial context degrade pretty significantly because, at least in Ontario, they're mostly maintained by the licensee in their basements, in commercial lockups, or maybe they partner with a local museum to take a collection from them, and the museum gets that collection. Oh, we got a whole exhibit, and box. Where the hell's the good stuff? You know, oh, it's in this one bag. Of this, you know, 20 boxes of stuff. And so those things start to degrade as well too. And interestingly, this year in Ontario, the province paid Ipsos Reid to do a survey of archaeologists and others on their attitudes towards collection management. And the results quite eye-opening. First, everyone acknowledges that there's this massive crisis, that we have to do something. And then consistently, commercial archaeologists say, it's not my responsibility. Don't make my clients pay for that. And the government regulators pretty consistently say, well, you know, it's the licensee responsibility. And okay, maybe we need a warehouse to throw all this stuff in. But that's about it in terms of management mentalities in this. So really, you know, it's hard not to think that the extractive consumptive paradigm, in the actuality of practice, not in the promise of our rhetoric, is really all about recovering everything from the record with profit and cost solely focused around that moment of extraction and report production. And then really our job collectively seems to be ensuring this accumulated output remains out of sight, mind, and access. I'm just going to go ahead and move it. Oh, there's my little box. Okay. But the problem is it's kind of hard to keep this dirty laundry under wraps because we are talking about collections and have been actually for 40 years in terms of our organizations, American and Canadian and regional, of the collections process as a crisis. And you don't have to look far for examples of crises. In Ontario, we've had examples of individual consultants dying suddenly, and their company offices, well, the rent comes up a week later, their spouse and family are not archaeologists, and the landlord comes in and cleans everything up because he wants to rent the space and or whatever. But basically, this guy's lifetime accumulation of material, his legacy, and the individual I'm thinking of would have agreed that was his legacy, is in a landfill 2 weeks after he dies. That's a bit of a problem. More importantly, the questions from proponents and certainly from the public and from descendant groups are, you know, what is the state of these collections? Why are they being held on to? For what purpose? And, you know, at current status quo, things will only get better rather than improve. So something has to change. And really, we're kind of in this hyperdrive, this super saturated, steroid enhanced version of conventional archaeological practice, of pulling everything out of the ground. And so we need to ask why. Why do we keep doing this, and what should outcomes be? So we need to change attitudes and change sensibility and really think a little bit differently about what archaeology, and importantly archaeology conservation in society, is supposed to achieve in order to address these concerns. Just watching time, want to get to the cool stuff. In short, status quo is neither viable nor sustainable. We need to build instead a sustainable archaeology. And this is two talks that sort of merged together. And I realized as I was looking at these slides just a few minutes ago that that break in the two talks kind of makes me seem like a knight in shining armor. And that's not what I'm trying to convey at all. That's neither what we can do, nor it's what is called for. But we were lucky enough, myself and Aubrey Cannon, to secure a very large Canada Foundation for Innovation research grant to build two facilities whose stated intent is really to pull together the archaeological collections from Ontario, primarily from commercial archaeologists, to integrate those collections, amass them, digitize them, and make them accessible in ways that have not been able to be done before. In part, this inspiration is just the perplexity of trying to make sense of the archaeological record in this day and age. When I first started at Western, an MA student I happened to be on their examining committee reported on, I think it was 22 fluted points that they had tracked down to advance a study that had been done 15 years earlier. And her MA was all about, well, you know, this person said that consultant had dug up a fluted point site, and I went to him, he didn't. But he told me about another person who thought he had too, and you know, after 6 months was able to pull them out for me. And this process of following archaeologists all along in their wake netted her this small sample of points, which she measured, length, width, thickness, and various metric attributes of the points themselves and source material, and that was her MA. And it seemed crazy to me. And really one of the things we want to do here is, if nothing else, we want to be able to deliver that kind of information to anyone who's looking for it with a couple of clicks of a mouse. And the challenge then to the archaeologist is, what's your thesis going to be about? Because it ain't going to be about tracking down 13 or whatever it was points and measuring them. You got to do something more. So we really see that accumulated record as the potential we all think of it as to generate value-added research post-excavation and initial processing. And really that's our aim at Sustainable Archaeology. And in so doing, we want to engage people to think about what archaeology is in society differently and how we participate in this society over all of our heritage. So, so you're going to build an archaeological repository. Well, the first thing we had to do is amass collections. And so both facilities have very large holding repository labs. And these labs are not state-of-the-art archaeological or museum holding facilities. These are inspired by someone like Kmart or a Walmart and their regional depot centers. So we have sliding shelving that go up as high as the zoning would allow us, 16 feet in London's case. We have a cherry picker that takes us up top there, or wobbles at the top, so only some of us get to go up there. And we store these collections in polypropylene boxes on these shelves. We also recognize, and I should mention, that's how most archaeologists store collections now. I've seen your labs, I know you have various cardboard iterations of this, and if you go to any consultant company, that's what you see, stacks and stacks of usually cardboard, but sometimes plastic, banker's boxes or archival storage boxes. So since we're taking collections primarily from CRM, our facility has to make sense to their day-to-day life, their process. So the collections come in these boxes on these shelves, but we also recognize that some of our partner friends, descendant community friends, for example, and some archaeologists as well have said, you know, there are certain classes of artifact that should not be in the boxes. They should be handled differently. And in fact, maybe there's some artifacts that shouldn't be accessible without some kind of consent. So we also have series of storage lockers They all have keys in them, and they all have 2 keys in them, and I'll get back to that later on in the talk. But amassing a massive amount of collections is a real challenge, because how do you keep track of everything? And I don't know about you guys here, but I certainly spent many a year inhaling nail polish and writing on ink on artifacts, and then putting that stuff in a box, and then someone puts something else in the box or removes it because they're trying to get something behind it, and next thing you know, where the frick's the box? And that's managing a couple of hundred or 1,000 boxes in one facility. The capacity we have at Western is to take 54,000 boxes before we hit capacity, and McMaster takes another 32,000. So, and we know that's more than exists right now as legacy collections, but of course we're thinking long term. And the only thing we do know is the more collections in our database, in our informational platform, the more robust the research that can come out of it. So we need to track this stuff. So one of the things we do is we don't put catalog numbers on, because of course these have to be randomly generated in the database. They are 10 characters long, so I'm not going to be writing 10 characters out on every diagnostic artifact. So we just print them out on DM codes, those little square squiggly things there. We can print them so that they're still legible to any kind of scanner, including your smartphone, at 3 by 3 millimeters, so they can mount onto pretty much any size artifact you need. And you just use a paraloid to hold the scan in place, and that works fine. We also use DM codes to label our shelves and our boxes. So the idea is you throw a box on a shelf, you scan the box, you scan the shelf. Our database tells us that this is where that box is from that point on. If I take it off the shelf, I can scan the box, scan the shelf again, and remove that association. And when it goes back on the shelf, I don't have to put it back in the same place. I can put it where I want. I don't have to worry that site X, all the boxes have to fit in a row right here. They can be anywhere, including half of the collection at McMaster University for research and half the collection at Western if we wanted to go that route. The other thing is our box labels all have RFID tags, those little things that, you know, if you walk out of a store without getting it scanned, the bells go off. So we have scanners all over the facility. So if we're moving collections from one room to another for various, you know, documentation, digitization, photography, etc., we don't have to scan those boxes. The scanners read the boxes as we go through, and the database is updated to say this is where that box is. And that works if the box shows up at McMaster, or if it leaves our part of the facility, which is on the side of the Museum of Ontario Archaeology, and it goes over in there. And the same thing works if we wanted to RFID tag, although they're bigger tags, a chunk of an artifact or to go in a gallery, or that we can track that movement back and forth. And that's kind of essential, because otherwise I'd be losing even more hair on a regular basis just trying to figure out where boxes are. Okay, so a core part of sustainable archaeology is all about converting object data into digital information, and there's a couple of reasons why. One, to make that information, and it's the information of those artifacts that's the important thing in archaeology that we study and analyze. The things themselves are really the medium by which we extract meaning, interpretation, and information. So we want to digitize as much of that as we can. Likewise, if we are digitizing these collections, then we can remove stuff from information. Information is what archaeologists want to do research on. The stuff and who owns it, who cares for it, then becomes a separate discussion that removes the archaeologist's fear of losing their stuff because they still have access to that digital information. And I should mention briefly that we've worked closely with TDAR in University of Arizona and ADS at University of York in England, who are really world leaders in archaeological informatics and the online, making online accessible archaeological data. And we're working with them. TDAR actually is going to be developing a module for us on our online access of associated records, whatever those happen to be, reports, GIS data, images, photographs, etc. Okay, this is the boring stuff, unless you're buried in it like I am. So we got to build an informational platform, and you start off by building a database. And the informational platform means we're bringing in collections, and we've actually had to think through what collections are. So there's legacy collections. They're all the stuff that's been pulled out of the ground in the past and are sitting in some warehouse somewhere. There's also ongoing transfers. There's collections to be made. When someone is submitting a bid for a stage 4 excavation, a full-scale site excavation, we want them to start incorporating a budget for the long-term care of the collections they're going to make. Because right now, consultants do not. They do not budget that portion of the cost to care for collections in their projects. So we bring all those collections in. Is that no, that's no, that's no, that's no. All right, doesn't matter. All those collections come in, we process and digitize them, and we need basically a database of databases, the way it works. We have our basic collections database, which is just a SQL relative database. It's built in MySQL, and it's alphanumeric, and it's here's your site, here's the context for the site, here's the artifact type, here's the attributes I want to record for that artifact, next. So that builds up the basic inventory or inventory management component of the collections. There's also the reports and field records, there's maps and images database, there's also born digital data sets. If you talk to consultants right now, increasingly they go in the field with iPads, and the basic recovery of information, contextual and otherwise, is all generated and populated into forms that then spew out their report very quickly afterwards. So we want those to flow in neatly, and then any of the research we do, any of the stuff that we play around with needs to be part of that database, and it needs to be tracked across that database so that if I'm interested in this site or that artifact type, I can pull all those out and also the relevant information. And as a result, we've been building a number of informational tools. We've been focused primarily on the front end, and I'm happy to say we're in advanced beta testing of that, and holy cow, that's taken 3 years. I did not know that people who write code for a living and develop databases actually come from another planet, from the one that I'm on. And boy, it's hard having conversations with those guys. Anyways, we have basic layout of our database. We have how you upload information, how you input information. But of course, if you're going to have a database that makes sense, the terminology has to be consistent. And it can't be, you know, is that granite ware or CC ware or a white ware? It's got to be one or the other. So we've had to make choices along the way that make sense and are actually factual and useful to use, because everyone has their own little idioms. And our database, by the way, also has almost on every page a comment section at the end of the input. And so if archaeologist A is just hardcore, wants to input the rim sherds by a topology like Richard McNeish's topology, he can tell me that that's Lawson incised or pound necked in there. And then that's text that you can search for, but it's not an attribute that I'm going to worry about because there's too much variability in the community to get there. Our friends in the UK at the ADS, they actually have a glossary for archaeologists to use for the entire prehistoric record. So they're way ahead of us, but that's the kinds of things we have to generate. We also want partner staff consultant companies. I'd rather them input that information when they're processing their collections as they're coming in. So we've created the database so that they can input directly that information. They get what they need for their license reports, and we don't have to replicate what they do. Because the one thing we know is essays, collections, and information is only going to be as good as the information of the worst collection by the worst consultant that's been brought into our system. So it has to be flexible as well as robust to manage that. Once we have that platform in place, once we have all this in, the next stage is to build the front-end portal. People who want to get in there to do research, and that's the fun stuff, and that's the stuff that we'll probably be doing over the next decade, I think. But so the database is in SQL, but we also extracted to what's called a graph database. We use Neo4j, and if anyone can write Neo4j, I've got a job for you, because they're really rare in archaeology. But it means that I don't have to map every relationship between every attribute in the database. They're all relative, and the relative ontologies that you or someone else wants to explore the database, you get to do that yourself without my having to map it for you beforehand. We're also playing around with various imaging options for being able to search by shape rather than by word or number. We are trying to develop right now a module or apply for a grant to translate some of this terminology into Mohawk as a different way of querying the database, because we don't want, if I build this database for the 250 or 300 archaeologists in Ontario, holy cow, what a waste of public funds. Because, you know, we can talk to each other about that. But if this is accessible much broadly and beyond archaeology, then it's got to be useful to those guys too. So it has to be that it's not just those guys who care what a Kramer point is, for example, or a Barnes fluted point, because if you're not an archaeologist, and most archaeologists don't know what that is, unless they're specialists in that area, then I need to come up with other ways for the database to be accessible. I've even got a student who's trying to create heritage narratives, histories, from just keywords tied to artifact types, and when you search them, you get a random generated linkage of these terms to tell stories. So lots of things that we can do there and play on that database. The other thing we do is we want to do value-added research ourselves on that assembled collection, because think about it, I don't have to say, I want to study this site or this part of the site. I can say, I want to understand the size of fish otoliths from 4,000 years ago to 500 years ago on these kinds of rivers in southern Ontario. Or I want to understand the change in stone technologies across, 400 sites. I can do that when all this is compiled. And what we want to do is engage with that collection to try to do these long-term studies. So one of the things we have in London is a micro CT scanner. It's just like in a hospital, only it's designed to scan car engines and complex engineering like that to make sure at a micron level everything's fitting. We stick pretty much anything you can imagine into that machine to scan it, including artifacts. So for example, let me just get those up. I'm interested in ceramics from about 1200 to 1400 AD. We can scan in the CT, sherds, and unlike a thin section where I can slice it off and cut it really thin and get a profile, I can get a complete picture of the temper of that sherd. And I can also sort it out by density, so quartz versus other kinds of inclusions. But the other cool thing that I think is just amazing is every soft-fired clay has all kinds of void spaces, little pockets of air. You'll see them as this goes through later on. They're lines, and they're just formed when the potter is making the clay and pressing that wet clay, and the air pockets form around the temper fragments. But if you're making the pot differently, those void spaces have the potential of being formed differently. There's those black lines, they're void spaces. So we can look at, we have site after site after site of much of this pottery. We can look at, for example, one generation of potters and the next to spot individual potters by the way they form their rim or their shoulder or their base of their pot, and also how the next generation, do they do the same thing in forming the pot? Do they play around slightly differently? We can also scan trade glass, because again, these are objects with different densities, so you can scan. All this is colorized, by the way, for our videos. But you can scan these as well too to look at manufacturing techniques, to look at inclusions, imperfections in the objects as well too. And in the software, you can take out the different densities, so you're just looking at one part of the object itself, in this case the white glass. And you can see the inclusions that are used to make the different colors. And over a long term, when you're looking at specimens from centuries of archaeological history, you can look at changes to those trends over that long-term time. And we've scanned, last Christmas we scanned a fruitcake, for example. Sometimes we're bored. The other thing we do in terms of value add, I want people to access this record and make sense of it. And the one things we want to do is do 3D scans of artifacts, of certainly at least diagnostic artifacts. So we have an array of scanners. We scan those objects and we want to deliver them online. So if you want the metrics of those artifacts, rim sherds, points, whatever it is, you should be able to access those online through a delivery system we're actually just installing right now that is cloud-based, and it's a point stream, so the meshes don't get brought over, but the color and the accuracy is still there. And on your screen, you can click on 2 points and get an accurate measurement down to about 20, 30 microns from point A to point B of the scan itself. Now, to do that, we're talking about scanning a lot of artifacts. So we've actually had to develop an assembly line 3D scanning process, and we were fortunate enough to get a grant from the province to develop this, and we have a series of 4 scanners. They're each calibrated to different size of artifact. There's a macro one that it says 1 centimeter. We've actually had very detailed scans of an object that's half a centimeter in size. So like trade beads, for example, or corn kernels. We can scan that way with these scanners. We do it very quickly. The quality is very good for analysis. If it's something that's complicated, if it's something that we really want a high definition scan of, we will do a more detailed scan. But then all these become both reference collections. And the cool thing about our delivery system is you can get that off your iPad or your phone. You can access these because the meshes don't go with the online access of the model. So you can pull that very quickly onto your phone. So if you're standing in the field and you got a point that you've never seen before, you can go to our database and call up points in that shape and compare them and see where they came from. And we've also been playing around with a 3D printer. So we create those 3D models, we capture the meshes, and then we have a color printer that, one of the few printers that print accurate colors or relatively accurate colors. And that allows us to, of course, share the results of findings broadly. We've had many descendant groups actually make requests for the diagnostics from a site they had monitors on, for example, or we've had a community that there's an ethnographic object, a pipe, that's held by another First Nation group in their museum. And this First Nation group wants that pipe back because it's part of their opening ritual of their council meetings. And the museum said, no, you can't have it, it's too fragile. It's got beads and feathers and all that. So they've asked us to scan the pipe and scan the stem so they can have a replica that they use in the ceremony itself. So there's these kind of interesting ways in which we can, once we have 3D models, we can start to engage with that record in different ways. The Wendat, for example, in their repatriation of graves and individuals last year, they requested that particular trade items that are very rare and unique be scanned in 3D models created before they went back in the ground. So if they decide at some point in the future that's important information they want, they still have access to that. And then kind of a fun thing we're doing is also creating immersive environments. So I don't know if any of you have heard of the Oculus Rift, but these are basically goggles you put on, and it's a 360 immersive environment that you go in. And we were lucky enough to have these computer animation design guys build for us the Lawson site, which is a 1600 or 1500 AD archaeological site by the museum. They were able to create this animation that you're seeing here of the village, but then they finished so quickly we decided to port it into a gaming engine, an Unreal gaming engine, and then run it through the Oculus Rift. And I did not bring the Oculus Rift here for you to try. And this is going to be a bit of a trick, so bear with me. Let's see if this works. Ah, yeah, it does. So we dumped it into a gaming engine, and no, it didn't. I'm watching it, but you're not. Oh, well, never mind. It's not going to work. Okay, so basically a gaming engine, first-person shooter, for those of you who may have watched someone else play a computer game in your life. You walk through your environment, right? So, and you put the goggles on, and you're walking through the Lawson site village. You walk into a longhouse, it goes dark. You walk up to a hearth, it gets bright again. We can populate that with our scanned 3D models. You can pick those up and interact with them. Someone in the other part of the world, when this is online, can walk and join you in that longhouse and talk about those artifacts with you. And it's that immersive environment. It is very. You got to sit down when you're wearing these goggles, or else you'll fall over because you feel as if you're walking through that space. And all of this, of course, is speculative. Anything above ground is speculative on our parts. And yet, when archaeologists wear these goggles, they put them on, they walk through and say, wow, this is really cool, this is great. Well, that's not right. And they'll do that to several things that they're looking at in the village. And so you say, well, why is it not right? Well, you know, it should be taller, or it should be rounder or squarer. This should be here, not there. All those kinds of things. And that's fascinating to me because, you know, how do you know that's not right? There is no right. There's a 1,000-year tradition of longhouse building that changed over time. Many different cultures make longhouses differently. So you mean it's not right for the Lawson site at 1500 AD or for southwestern Ontario before 1000 AD? But they have mental templates that they bring to play, the imagination that we all have of the past. I have friends at the Oneida First Nation Reserve as well too, some traditionalists there who've also worn the goggles, and when they go through, they go, that's very interesting, but it's not right. And then they tell me what's not right, and it's completely different stuff than what the archaeologist has. So here's a way to, through that immersive experience, get at these kinds of what we're thinking the past actually looked like or worked. And we can populate it with these artifacts from the facility, We can do things like we can virtually cross-mend wrens by picking one up in the house and walking to a min and picking up another sherd and virtually cross-mending those models. And so, of course, it also has great application for public education and accessibility. So we can do all kinds of stuff like that. Lastly, I want to mention that Sustainable Archaeology is not myself, it's not my partner Aubrey Cannon. It is many people, but we have an advisory committee, and we're starting out with 12 individuals. Monsieur Lesage is a member of the advisory committee himself. We have 6 archaeologists and 6 individuals from various First Nations communities. And the whole point of this advisory committee is just to talk through the logics for how SA should manage collections, the questions that come up for collections. So for example, we have the micro CT scanner. My friends in the medical sciences faculty are really interested in using it themselves, which is great for me because I can charge them an arm and a leg because they have big grants to use the machine. And there's one colleague who he works with surgeons who replace hips, and he wants to scan the hips, the fragment of or the portion of the hip that's removed before it's replaced in elderly folks, because he wants to understand the degradation of a number of things on that human specimen. But before I could agree to something like that, I need to go to the advisory committee and say, so what do you think? Is this acceptable or not? I don't have an opinion. The advisory committee will talk about this. They'll tell me whether they think this is okay. If they do, they will. If they don't think we should, then we won't. And everything from collections in, or human remains in old collections, what do you do with them? All those kinds of things. Are there sacred objects that should be handled differently? And the way it works is there's 6 archaeologists and 6 First Nations individuals. And so let's say there's smoking pipes have been raised by concern by this man, Dean Jacobs, at Walpole Island. It's like, you know, some people feel all smoking pipes are sacred and they should be handled differently and access to them should be more controlled. So if a researcher wants to come in and access those pipes to do something, so we can review that proposal and bring it to the advisory committee. And if the archaeologists say, wow, this is really important study, it's going to be advanced, whatever, then I can unlock one of those keys in those storage cabinets. But then the other individuals from the First Nations community, they'd also have to say or come to a consensus feeling that yes, this is okay. If they say no, then the other lock's not open. And the default is you don't access those pipes. But our obligation is to give that individual feedback and say, these are the concerns that are raised. These are what we think you need to address. And if you want to address them, come back at us and we'll review it again, which is exactly how grant applications work. And that's all we want to do here. We want to change the language from control and I'm going to lose control over my stuff to, of course, how we can work together on these collections. And really that's what Sustainable Archaeology is trying to do. It's trying to think that, for archaeologists to think that we have a responsibility for what we do, for what we harvest, and we also have a responsibility in our society today, not so much to advance what's of interest to us. It's cool, and you know, I'll gush up the yin-yang to my family about my pipe study or my rimsherd study or whatever it is I happen to be studying. But you know, their eyes will glaze over and nod politely. But that's because that's me. But what is of value to beyond me? And if the role of archaeologists and CRM actually sets this vision of this paradigm shift, because CRM archaeologists ultimately are in the service of all those interests in society that come together over the contested past. And if we were more in the service of and found our research within the spaces that allows, rather than advancing archaeological agendas, I think we could actually do a lot more, both of relevance in society and a lot more with those collections we say we care so much about. And that's my talk. Sorry, going on.